Hi, welcome to Meet Up with Austin. I'm Austin Fuhrman with a very interesting guest today, longest serving governor of Massachusetts, who came out of nowhere to win the Democratic nomination in 1988 for the presidency, Michael Dukakis. Before we get to your career and what you're up to now, and I'd like to talk a little bit about your childhood and what led to you having a lifelong commitment to public policy. So can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing and what led to you having an interest in this area?
Okay. Both of my parents were immigrants. My dad, from a predominantly Greek town in western Turkey, where there were 1.5 million Greeks back in the late 19th, early 20th century. His parents were originally from the island of Lesbos, which is just off the Turkish coast, and which was the place, by the way, where that little boy washed up, drowned. One of the most difficult photographs I think people have ever seen, just kind of reflected the tragedy of this refugee thing. And when my dad was 15 in 1912, he decided he was going to come to the United States over the violent objections of his father to get an education, which was very unusual in those days. Most young Greek men came over here to get a job, not an education. I mean, most of them didn't have more than 3 or 4 years of elementary school education. And my father arrived in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1912. Didn't speak a word of English, didn't have a nickel in his pocket. He had a couple of brothers who were working in the textile mills in Lowell and Lawrence in Massachusetts. And 12 years later, that young man was graduating from the Harvard Medical School. And how he did it, I have no idea. I mean, it seems inconceivable to me these days. And in fact, he lived in a room on the top floor of a house on Bowker Street in Brookline, Massachusetts, 4 blocks from where Kitty and I have been living for the last 53 years. Graduated from Harvard Medical School, became a doctor, and practiced medicine for 52 years. On Huntington Avenue in Boston, right across from the Museum of Fine Arts, and a stone's throw from the Greek Orthodox Cathedral. He was a remarkable guy in just many, many ways, and beloved by his patients. My mother came over here in 1913 from the city of Larissa in Greece, which is a fairly substantial provincial capital in central Greece. She was 9, and went to the Winter Street Elementary School in Haverhill, Massachusetts, another factory town. This one making shoes, not textiles, just down the road from Lowell. And thanks to an elementary school principal who had a very special way with immigrant kids, she not only did well, she continued to do well in school, strongly encouraged by Mr. Gray. And my mother was the first Greek young woman ever to go away to college unescorted in the history of the United States. We cannot find anybody else who did that before her. And she went to Bates College in Lewiston, Maine, graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 1925. I mean, these 2 immigrant kids. It's a story Trump should listen to.
Yeah.
And she became a teacher. Got my dad married, had 2 boys. My brother, who was older than I was by about 3 years, and I. So how did I get involved in politics? Well, here's the story for you. So I'm a 3rd grader at the Edith C. Baker School in Brookline, Massachusetts. Brookline is a town just outside of Boston. And Mary Ripley, my teacher, decides to have the election of class officers. In the 3rd grade, it was right in the middle of World War II, so we were all into this. And for reasons I'm not sure I understand, my classmates elected me president of class, 3rd grade. And years later, when I became governor, I discovered Mrs. Ripley was still teaching in the town of Groton, right on the New Hampshire border. I called her up and I said, how would you like to come down to the State House? And bring your children, your students with you, and introduce them to the guy that you got started in politics.
Wow.
And just a week ago, I spoke at an event at the Cal State Fullerton Library. And who do you think showed up? Mrs. Ripley's son.
Oh, her son.
Her son, yeah, who I never met, who lives out here. and came with an album with pictures of that day when she brought her class from Groton to the State House to see me. You know, those are the very special moments that you have in this business. And did Mary Ripley do it? I don't know. Was it my Greek background? You know, every Greek kid learns early that democracy began in Athens. Was it the obvious injustice around me at a time when the United States was racist, it was anti-Semitic, we had terrible poverty in our cities, back when America was great, right? No, America was not great in those days. And for whatever reason, I got interested. And then a guy named Joe McCarthy came along, a Republican United States Senator from Wisconsin. And we even have a name these days for what he brought with him, McCarthyism. Rabid, anti-communist, accusatory, not unlike Trump in some respects, but worse actually. And I was just appalled by this guy. I thought he was just trampling on civil rights, civil liberties, didn't seem to understand what democracy was all about. And I went to Swarthmore College outside of Philadelphia. Very active politically. It was kind of a hotbed of anti-McCarthy sentiment. Graduated in 55, was active, quite active politically. Graduated in 55, came back to Boston, and 6 weeks later I was being sworn into the United States Army. We had a draft at the time. And 3 days after I got to Fort Dix, New Jersey, for my first 8 weeks of basic training, I had what passed for a personnel interview, conducted by another draftee who was a personnel specialist. But he's got a file on me. I'm this Greek kid from Boston. Just spent 4 years at Swarthmore College. And he opens it up and he says, so I see you ran a fundraising drive for the American Civil Liberties Union while you were on the Swarthmore campus. I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I did. And he said, and you were the chairman of the Students for Democratic Action, which was the student wing of the Americans for Democratic Action, which was a liberal democratic organization. I said, yeah. As a matter of fact, I didn't tell him this, but I was succeeded as chairman of the SDA at Swarthmore by a guy named Carl Levin, who just finished serving for 18 years in the United States Senate from Michigan, a great guy. And the interview continued along these lines. This guy had a file on me with every single political activity that I'd ever engaged in at Swarthmore College in the early 50s. Where do you think that he got that information? We learned about 10 years later that the FBI had a tap on the Swarthmore switchboard. And in those days, there were no cell phones, and you didn't have phones in the rooms. You had to go through the switchboard. And they were recording every single telephone conversation that went through that place. And as I started popping up as a guy that apparently was interested in politics, they created a file on me. And they must have had millions of these things. If they had one on me, they must have had one on 1,000 people. That was McCarthyism. And I was not a fan of McCarthyism. Unquestionably, that guy had a lot to do with me getting into politics. And then I said, John Kennedy began running for the presidency. He came from my hometown. You know, we all related to Kennedy in so many ways. And from that point on, I got really interested, active, and then ran for the legislature, was elected 4 times, and ran for governor.
I see.
Won, lost, won. So ran 4 times and won 3 times.
Yeah. You mentioned the U.S. Army. You deferred a Harvard Law education to enlist in the U.S. Army. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience in the U.S. Army?
Well, I was a draftee, like thousands of others. Trained initially at Fort Dix, New Jersey, and then a place called Camp Gordon, Georgia, which was a Signal Corps facility. And then was shipped to Korea and to the remnants of a town called Munsan, Korea, which had been wiped out. It was right in the middle of the war zone. Fortunately for me, the war was over and the truce had been signed. But it was a kind of still a pretty dangerous place in many ways. And like most experiences, it was an important experience for me. I wouldn't recommend it again and again, but it was an important experience for me.
I'd like to know a little bit about your most proud accomplishments as governor of Massachusetts.
Well, first, the state government that I walked into in 1962 as a young state legislator was one of the three or four most corrupt states in the country. It was really bad. And I thought one of my jobs ought to be to try to help clean it up. And I think if you talk to people in Massachusetts, they'll tell you that we did a pretty good job of, not that every once in a while somebody doesn't do something dumb that's dishonest, but by and large, I think we did that. And then I inherited an economy which was a disaster. It had the second highest unemployment rate in the country. This was in 1975. It had the biggest state deficit proportionally in the country. They were calling us the new Appalachia. I mean, it was pretty fierce. So my job was to do what? Try to turn that around and do a lot of other good things at the same time. And over the course of 12 years, I'd like to think we did a lot. We did a lot. And some slippage, but today Massachusetts is thriving, especially the eastern 2/3 of the state. We still have work to do in the western part of the state and southeastern Massachusetts. And it's the envy of most other states. It's got the best public educational system in the country. And generally is doing exceedingly well. And I'd like to think that I made some contribution to that.
Yeah. Fast forwarding a little bit to the 1988 election for president.
Right.
Would you go back and change, if there could be one thing you go back and change?
Two things. If you'll allow me to.
Yeah.
First, I made a decision, which turned out to be a dumb decision, that I was not going to respond to the Bush attack campaign. There had been an enormous amount of polarization and anger and this kind of stuff under Reagan. And I just thought people were ready for something a lot more positive. And I'm a positive guy. I'm not an attacker. I mean, I'm a guy that likes to get things done and pull good people together and turn them loose on issues and problems. I thought the country was ready for something a lot more positive than what we had had under Reagan, with an enormous amount of polarization. Not unlike today. And it turned out that was just a big mistake. I mean, if the other guy's going to come at you, particularly with stuff that's either inaccurate or oftentimes unfair, your job is to make sure that people understand the truth and to develop a strategy in advance for dealing with it that effectively blunts the attacks and gives you an opportunity to continue to remain positive. And secondly, I had been elected over and over again with very strong precinct-based grassroots organizations, meaning what? A precinct captain and 6 block captains in every single precinct, making personal contact on an ongoing basis with every single voting household. And I spent too much time, as I was thinking about running, talking to people who I thought knew more than I did about winning the presidency, all of whom poo-pooed the idea on a national level of a precinct-based grassroots organization, maybe for city council or something, but not for a big country in this country. They were just dead wrong, and unfortunately I spent too much time listening to them. And we did not do the kind of precinct-based grassroots organizing that we should have done.
I see. Looking back on that election, the technology in 1988 compared to 2017 is really different. How would you compare the 24-hour news cycle and Twitter and how things have changed since then?
Well, this may sound strange to you, but I'm not sure fundamentally it changes much. Oh, sure, there's new technology, there's this whole Twitter thing, which Trump apparently has used, at least to some extent, to good effect. But one of the reasons I'm committed to precinct-based grassroots organizing is because I don't think you ever ought to minimize the impact of person-to-person, door-to-door, neighborhood-to-neighborhood campaign. And if you buy into the more modern version of computers, handheld computers, this kind of stuff, running around doing stuff, I think two things happen. First, you don't do the door-to-door, precinct-to-precinct, person-to-person kind of campaign. And secondly, you aren't connecting with an awful lot of people that you should be connecting with. And I'm particularly concerned about my own party, because it was obvious we did not connect with anywhere near as many people as we should have. We bought into this red-blue narrative. You know, that's red, that's blue, which is, I think, just a terrible mistake. A terrible mistake.
Was Hillary Clinton lacking a clear message?
No, I don't think she was lacking a clear message. She was taking an enormous amount of pounding. And that started, you know, years before. All of this email stuff was at least broadly supervised by the State Department. And as we know, other secretaries of state had similar private email arrangements. In fact, I don't know of a single person in Washington of any significance doesn't have a private email. I mean, it's the only way you get a hold of them. If I wanted to get a hold of my former lieutenant governor who became Secretary of State, I wouldn't email John Kerry at state.gov, you know? You need either what? A cell phone or a private email. And all of that stuff was, I thought, absolute nonsense. So but she took a terrible pounding on it, and it wasn't because she didn't have a lack of clear message. I thought the message "Stronger Together" was a very good one. I thought she was terrific at the debates. I thought she clearly defeated Trump in every single one of those debates. I mean, in some cases, it wasn't even close. And she won by 3 million votes. But under this crazy system we have with the Electoral College, she didn't become president. Now, the faster we can get rid of that, the better. It should have been abolished 250 years ago, or a couple of hundred years ago.
You mentioned you thought Hillary Clinton really obliterated Donald Trump in those presidential debates.
Not she obliterated him, but
Maybe wrong word
clearly, you know,
had the upper hand.
Yeah, he was kind of a strange duck up there wandering around, and almost, as she said, it almost looked as if he was stalking her, you know. But for whatever reason.
With that in mind, were you surprised that Donald Trump won the presidency?
If you had asked me this question on the 12th day before the election, I would have said, yeah, because she had it locked before Comey got up and made those statements. I don't think there's any question about it. And why he did, I don't know. I think he's a pretty decent guy. I don't think it was done for partisan reasons. He was under a lot of pressure from Republican House chairmen to release them. Obviously, he didn't do his homework, didn't know what they were made up of. And as it turned out, the FBI already had these things. This was nothing new. So, the country's in an uproar, it's a week, 10 days, and so forth before the election. And I think it had a profound effect on what happened.
With all that's going on in the U.S. right now with protests and Women's March and all this, do you encourage people now more than ever to get involved in politics, especially younger people?
All the time. And in fact, what's happened, it's very interesting. I mean, I certainly sense it in my classrooms and talking to students here. What's happened is that her loss has triggered a much greater interest in the political process on the part of young people. A determination to go out there and do something about this kind of situation. And I hope that includes supporting the National Popular Vote campaign, which, as you probably know, is a way of abolishing the Electoral College without necessarily amending the Constitution. And so, you know, I am much encouraged by these young people. I've been teaching now for 26, 27 years, 21 of them here at UCLA. And my students are eager, they're enthusiastic, they're strongly committed, they're angry, but they want to make a difference, and I do everything I can to encourage them, obviously.
Now that the Republicans control the Senate and the House and the White House, does that make you want to jump in there and...
No, it does not, because I'm 83 years of age. I feel like $1 million, but I'm not sure I want to go down that road again, and there are lots of good people coming along.
You look great.
I feel good. I feel terrific. My mother used to say, if you want to live a long life, pick your parents carefully. So my dad died when he was 84, my mother when she was practically 100.
Jeez.
So, and Kitty's father was the associate conductor of the Boston Pops and was still conducting when he was 94, so we planned to be around for a while. But I'm not sure I'm ready for another presidential campaign. And in any event, it's time to develop some new blood, new talent, younger people coming along who can take the fight to the other side. I think, who knows what's going to happen to Trump. This first week has been a disaster, but let's assume he sticks around for at least 4 years. I mean, it's obviously going to be a major contest.
Yeah. A presidential campaign has to be mentally draining.
It's not so much mentally draining. This may sound strange to you, but it gets dull and boring. Can you believe that? How come? Well, because they're very long. I mean, I started campaigning seriously for the presidency in April of 1987. The election was November of 1988. That's a year and a half.
Yeah.
Now, I was also a governor. I was back to the Massachusetts State House regularly. I mean, one thing, if the fact that you've been a pretty good governor has something to do with the fact that you're a candidate, the last thing in the world you need is to see that administration of yours fall apart because you're not there. So I spent a fair amount of my time in Boston and at the State House. But the primary is lots of fun. It's one state campaign at a time. You're doing a lot of the same kind of thing you're normally doing. And I was at about 1% in the polls when I started. I mean, it's not that nobody gave me a chance. We had 7 of us. And with some interesting names. Al Gore was one of them. Dick Gephardt was another. Joe Biden was another. Jesse Jackson was another. It was an interesting field. And it was long. It was long. I finally clinched it in New York in April of 1988. Great, fine, terrific, right? And then you got to start all over again.
General election.
The general election. And again, after a while, I mean, how many times can you say the same thing? 5 times every day. Now, I think there are things we could have done to make it better. I think Clinton did a better job of that. But it's long. It's really long. But look, good, talented people out there. I hope and expect they're going to be running.
Can you tell us a little bit about your teaching at Northeastern and UCLA right now?
I was governor for 4 years, and I was defeated for re-election. And I came back and beat the guy that beat me, and then served another term beyond that.
So 3 out of 4 terms.
Yeah. So what did I do during the interim? I really wasn't interested in going back to my law practice. I never loved the law. I was with a great firm. They couldn't have been more supportive of me, but I didn't love the law. And I decided I wanted to teach. And fortunately, there was a great dean at the Kennedy School at Harvard, Graham Allison, who was nice enough not only to welcome me in, but basically said to me, why don't you sit in the back of the class with these 2 particular professors, each of whom, by the way, had been an excellent public manager and was a very good teacher. And I just want you to sit there for a couple of months and watch these guys operate. Note how they teach, what they do, how they go about it. That was a wonderful thing for him to do, because I really had a chance to sit at the feet of 2 really superb public servants and teachers. And it really kind of prepared me for going ahead and turning myself into what I hope is a reasonably decent classroom teacher.
Did they have 2 opposite styles?
Somewhat. They had somewhat different styles, though very similar experiences. Gordon Chase was a superb teacher. I mean, one of the best I've ever seen. Manny, very good also, Manny Carballo, but in a different way. And at the Kennedy School, I'm not sure what they're doing it these days, but the Kennedy School, they use case methods a lot. I use them in my teaching. Still, it's the only way I know to really teach public policy and public management. And so you teach, if you teach with cases, you teach Socratically. You don't get up and lecture for an hour and a half, which would bore me to death anyway. I can't imagine listening to myself talk for an hour and a half. So I teach Socratically. I use case studies. And my students seem to be engaged by that. And I call on people. I mean, this is not Dukakis lecturing,
It's a stimulating conversation.
Yeah, which makes teaching a lot more interesting and gives you an opportunity to get to know your students early on, which I try to do. So the teaching side of my life has really been terrific. It's best thing I ever did. I mean, best decision I've ever made. And I'm still going at it, and I've been teaching for 26, 27 years.
For people that may not know, can you tell us what the Next Generation Initiative is?
Well, there are a couple of them. I mean, going by different names. One of them involves a largely Greek American organization, which tries to get young Greek Americans of the next generation deeply and actively involved in public life. And I've been very active with them. And then the other that I'm familiar with is a foundation that my younger daughter is deeply involved in called Too Young to Fail. And I think there's a next generation piece to that. We've learned from research that disadvantaged kids, if given an opportunity to learn early, just to listen to music, to experience sights and sounds and this kind of thing, seem to gain enormously in terms of their ability to learn. So my car is deeply involved in that foundation, and doing what? Trying to bring early education to these youngsters in a way that will help them enormously.
What do you do for fun?
What do I do for fun?
What are some of your hobbies?
What are some of my hobbies? Well, I'm married to the best-looking Medicare recipient in America, even though she's just turned 80. And these days we're great walkers. I was a cross-country runner. I ran the Boston Marathon when I was 17 in 1951. It was a record field of 300, if you can believe it. But Kitty and I love walking, and we do a lot of it. We spend a lot of time together. And one of the things that not being in office makes it possible for you to do is to do some reading. You do a lot of reading when you're in office, but it's memos, it's policy statements, it's this, it's that, it's the other thing. And I love history. I never read fiction because I think the real thing is a lot more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But I always have a history book of some kind. I just finished Doris Kearns Goodwin's book on Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and the muckraking journalists of that. And let me tell you something. There are not only great similarities, but the American people are worried about domestic terrorism. They ought to go back and read that book. Because we had at least two groups. One was made up of Marxist communists, and the other was made up of anarchists, largely from Italy. And they were out there blowing people's houses up every day. In fact, once, this was back in 1917, 18, 1919, they actually blew up the house of the incumbent Attorney General in Washington, a guy named Palmer, who happened to be a Swarthmore graduate, and is the guy who created the so-called Palmer raids. The precursor, I think, really, to the FBI raiding people's homes, taking these folks and deporting them and so on and so forth. But I think there was a weekend in the Northeast, back 1917, 1890, can't remember, where bombs went off in 7 different cities. Domestic bombs planted in 7 different cities in the United States. The country was petrified. And the hysteria that came out of that, you can imagine, people were scared, had a lot to do with the indictment of a couple of guys named Sacco and Vanzetti in Boston. It was one of the great notorious cases. Italian immigrants, so far as anybody could tell, peaceful, but they were Italian anarchists, not to be confused with Marxists. And neither one of those guys committed the crime. We now know that that's pretty definitely the case. They weren't even close to Braintree, Massachusetts, where the crime was committed. But they were railroaded through that trial. It was just appalling, with a judge who was a little crazy and a strong anti-communist. He was quoted by somebody as saying, I think during the trial, "Did you see what I did to those commie bastards?" This is a judge in Massachusetts. And subsequently, years later, was discovered trying to direct traffic in Harvard Square. The guy, anyway, it was terrible injustice. I was governor in 1977, which was the 50th anniversary of their execution. And I issued a proclamation basically saying, I can't pardon these guys, but Massachusetts should exonerate them because it was obvious they didn't commit the crime. And I'm reading Doris Kearns Goodwin and all about this these Italian anarchists and Marxist communists who are running around terrorizing the country. I mean, terrorizing the country. This is 1915, 16, 17, 18. And you got this attorney general who's running around going after him. I mean, as unconstitutionally as he possibly can. Well, it's one of the reasons you read history. To remind you that these kinds of things have happened before. Not that it ought to make us any more complacent, but there's something reassuring about the fact that the country is still here, even though this stuff was going on. And boy, was it going on.
You read a lot of books. Are you a David McCullough fan?
I'm a David McCullough fan. Huge.
Where do you see yourself in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think I'll continue to do teaching until somebody taps me on the shoulder and says, Dukakis, you're losing it. I love teaching. I love working with young people, and love the opportunity it gives a guy like me to share, whatever I know about things. 2 of my former UCLA students are now committee chairs in the California Assembly, and I'm very proud of them. One of them, Jimmy Gomez, is running for Congress. He was a student of mine here.
Jeez.
And I've got hundreds and hundreds of former students now that are out there doing all kinds of great work. My student assistant a few years ago here in the graduate program is now the mayor of Riverside, California. And Rusty Bailey is doing a terrific job in Riverside. And I've got lots and lots of folks obviously on the East Coast doing the same thing. So it's a wonderful feeling to be able to do this, and I'd like to think I'm contributing to a better country and a better world. And I'd like to think that those of us who are teaching, especially these kinds of subjects, are doing that. Think so, and it's great fun to do it.
To wrap up Meet Up with Austin, I'd like to ask Michael Dukakis what your thoughts are on politics today.
I don't think fundamentally, this may sound strange to people, I don't think fundamentally it's changed that much. Nor do I think that the best way to get elected has changed. It's a precinct captain and 6 block captains making personal contact on an ongoing basis with every single voting household. And I'm serious. It's the way I got elected and re-elected. Sadly, I didn't do it during the presidential campaign, a big mistake. And it took Barack Obama not once but twice to prove without any doubt that precinct-based grassroots organizing works. But you got to do it. I mean, you've got to do it. You can't kind of just knock on the door of only the people that are registered Democrats and voted in the last 4 elections. That is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about every single precinct, every single voter. And believe me, it works. Because I gave this little speech to Elizabeth Warren back when she was just starting to run and had never run for elective office, and she's sitting there taking notes. I was very impressed. And Kitty and I are sitting there getting to beat her, and also, there are 2,157 precincts in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. You've got to go out and get 2,157 precinct captains, each of whom recruit 6 block captains and neighborhood captains. Their job is to go out there and make personal contact with every single voting household. And she did it. So about 5 days before that election, both Boston newspapers published polls, one of which said it was tied, and the other one of which said Brown was ahead, Scott Brown was ahead. She beat him by 9 percentage points. How come? All those folks in the field. All those folks in the field. We went out, knocked on doors for her. So,
Definitely different.
if it's different, we didn't have Twitter, we didn't have this, we didn't have that. But if you were to come to me and say, look, I'm thinking of running for whatever, the assembly, if you got any advice from me, I would have said, I would say to you, let me give you the speech I gave Elizabeth Warren, and also to Val Patrick, who had never run for elective office, ran for governor of Massachusetts, won by 20 percentage points. 20! Believe me, it works, and too few people are doing it.
Alrighty, you heard it
Okay?
from Michael Dukakis, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Good to see you.
Good to see you
Great
too.
fun.
Yep.
This is Mike Dukakis, and you're watching Absolute KBEV.